right. Good afternoon, everybody, and good Erev Shabbos. I want to talk about a term that people have been using a lot recently, although it's an old term, and I believe that it's a term we should stop using. And I'm talking particularly people on the conservative side should stop using this term, which I mostly will identify myself as someone who's, I would guess, in America would be considered to be more on the right, although I really would consider myself to be, in a certain sense, more of a classical liberal who believes just, in liberty. And that, people can make the right choices on their own without the nanny state government, forcing us to do what's right. In any event, the term that I am finding to be offensive, and I think people should stop using, and I know a lot of other people agree, is a term called reverse racism. They'll say, for example, that when Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who, by the way, I work in a mental institution, and she looks like she escaped from a mental institution. I don't mean that in any way to insult the fine people who are residents of the mental institutions. But in any event, that's neither here nor there. But when she says that she, for the sake of diversity, she will refuse, and for the sake of diversity and inclusion, she will refuse to make any interviews with any white reporters, quote unquote white, whatever that means. I mean, I'm not like a piece of paper, a white piece of paper, I'm not like there's a house in front of me, that's white. But they use this word white, a ridiculous term, because these people just see everything in terms of race, and that's the point that I'm bringing out here. And so people will say, well, that's reverse racism. No, that's not reverse racism. That's just racism. There's no such thing as reverse racism. There's just racism. Racism means that you think race is important, that race means something. And it doesn't. It's a nonsensical, non sequitur ideology to put all people, and you see when you fill out these forms and you take a survey and they ask what race you identify with. So they say white, Caucasian. That's pretty much all of Europe and the Middle East, Northern Africa. That's white. Okay. Well, there's a tremendous amount of diversity just in Europe, let alone the Middle East and North Africa and so forth. But that's all white. Right? And then the Asian Pacific Islanders. There's tremendous diversity. And then, Latino, Latinx, they say, which is a bigger nonsense because there's no gender-neutral words in Spanish. There's no such thing as Latinx. That's the stupidest thing in the world if you know the basics of the Spanish language. Or Hispanic, or whatever. Hispanic is inclusive of people from Spain who I guess could be considered white. And then the same thing, people from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, those are black. Well, there are so many different tribes and today so many different countries and so many different cultures, and then cultures that developed of people who, for whatever reason, were brought to America, whether against their will or willingly. You have such a diversity of religions and traditions and all these things, and yet to the Democrat, all it is race. That's all they care about. And that's what racism is this whole idea that race, that's all that matters. Now, bigotry is different than racism. Now, there can be a form of bigotry that is racist, But there can be bigotry that's sexist. There can be bigotry that is religion-based, culturally based, nationality-based, and so forth. But again, bigotry is wrong, and racism is wrong. And there's an intersection between bigotry and racism. But not all racism is necessarily bigoted. It's still stupid. But when people are using this term reverse racism, what they're meaning is that the traditional victims of racial bigotry, those roles are apparently reversed. But the truth of the matter is, and so it's perhaps a reversal of bigotry, perhaps. But the truth of the matter is, no, we're all just human beings. The most important minority is the minority of one. It's the individual. That's what matters, at least here in America. You want to go to some communist country where they're collectivist and they just want to put you all into groups and it's just so they can divide and conquer and collectivize. That's what the left is pushing, because they use this canard of race as a means to have their ideology of collectivism realized. So for this reason, I think we should stop using this term reverse racism, because racism is just racism, and racism is always wrong. We are all human beings made in the image of God, and skin color shouldn't make any more difference than eye color. I at work we had a training on diversity, and it was a pretty good training by and large. It didn't have a lot of the very strong negative ideas that have been pushed recently, although it had some hints of that. But the hypocrisy, because one thing that they pointed out in this training about diversity is that and is what I just said, which is a truth, that race is a new idea. You didn't have this idea of race. Probably you want to go back 400 years ago, which that's an important time, because 400 years ago is when the left tells us that this country was founded, because that's 402 years ago is when the first slaves came to America, and that's what America was built on, which is not true. And the thing is that the difference between the 1776 project and the 1619 project you cannot minimize the importance of the difference between these two, and as well as the fact of the matter that this guy Joe Biden, who's occupying the White House, one of the first things he did was to get rid of the 1776 project. And it's related to something that I think, it's widely symbolic, but it's nonetheless a tremendous indicator of the ideology of the left today. Is that you had, and this was something I've spoken about many times, and people either ignored it or made light of it. But the tallest mountain in these 50 United States was called for a number of decades, at least, maybe even over 100 years, Mount McKinley, up in Alaska. And the traditional indigenous name was Denali, the Great One. And President Obama made some kind of executive action to say this mountain is no longer Mount McKinley. It's reverting to the traditional Native American name of Denali. This is related to a controversy that came up with former Senator Rick Santorum, where he said that there's not much Native American culture in American culture, and people found that to be racist. But there's a truth to that yes, of course we recognize with the many names of the many cities and towns and streets and all kinds of things, local sports teams and whatever else, rivers with the traditional indigenous names. And certainly the Native American culture is part of the multicultural makeup of the United States. But per capita, it's not the white culture either. It's the embrace of the totally universal ideology of America that makes America different and special. Meaning, yes, of course, the Native American culture is part of that, but it's not as encompassing, and it's not, meaning you have a makeup of many different cultures that come together, but the central idea, the ideology of the value of the individual as opposed to collectivism, I think is the central ideology of America, the rugged individualism of America, that countries like Europe don't understand. You're somewhere in, my ancestors came from the border of Hungary and Romania, and the fact of the matter is, where they, on one side, on my mother's father's side, right, and they identified very much, even though they were Jewish, they identified very much as Hungarian and not Romanian, right? And they spoke Hungarian, and that there was that certain collectivism of being Hungarian. And really the truth is, all of the European countries, there's this idea, you're French, you're German, you're Lithuanian, you're whatever. It's very much collectivist, and it's very much cultural, the language, the culture, the borders, these types of things. America is more of an idea. Someone like, say, Bono, a liberal person, right, from U2, from the United Kingdom. He said he thanks God every day for the United States of America, and he thanks America because America is not just a place on the map, but it's an idea. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of the indigenous people who I know appreciate that idea. They're thankful for the new ways that were brought from over the ocean, but really created here. These aren't European ideas, these are American ideas. These are something that takes a little bit from here and a little bit from there, but invents something totally new in these 50 United States that is unique in the annals of world history. But to take a landmark that was named for the executive officer under this constitutional system, meaning a mountain named for President McKinley, and to remove that name and to revert to the indigenous name as the official name under this country's system is reducing America to merely being just another place in the map, just another country like all the other countries. And that's not what America is. You know, I mean, I know Rabbi Daniel Lapin, he said that when he came, I believe, from South Africa to these United States, he was amazed because he'd never been to any other country where so many names of cities, towns, streets, neighborhoods, etc. are biblical names. Meaning you don't have that in Europe. You don't have that in South Africa. You don't have that in Australia. Why? Because these United States, you don't have that in Canada. You don't have it in Mexico. It's an American thing. You know, the only place where you're going to have the biblical names really is Israel, right? Because that's where it was. Or if you, or there were other countries that were in the Bible as well, you know. But like that, and even those other countries, that the names that come from the Bible, the cities that we have are named for biblical places, especially in Pennsylvania, but really all over the country. It's an amazing thing that you have this embrace of the Bible as part of our culture, and is a major part of our culture. And it's not the white man's Bible. It's a universal appeal and idea that this book is so beloved to the people who put together this country, in a way that the Bible was an amulet to the politicians of Europe. It wasn't a part of their life. It was more just a thing that was there. It's different than the European ways. Meaning, I remember Glenn Beck, he showed at a lecture he gave, I saw online, he showed the Bible of King George that we fought, you know, for our independence. And when a monarch is crowned in the United Kingdom, I guess it would be the Archbishop of Canterbury, gives him or her a Bible. And that is it harkens back to Deuteronomy, where the king had to write a Sefer Torah and have it with him at all times. But he had to read it every day. Whereas the European monarch, he has a priest hand him or her this book, but they showed how Glenn Beck showed how King George's Bible, he couldn't open it because he never opened it, as opposed to our founders, our patriots. They lived with the Bible. And that's something that to discuss here with this issue here. So essentially that's what we're talking about here. And I think that's the message. There is no reverse racism. There's just racism, and we have to overcome that. Stop seeing everybody as the other. Recognize, and the thing is, these people, they call themselves, they say, be anti-racist, notice color. No. On one hand, you give a good message that really race doesn't mean anything, and within the so-called races, there's a lot more diversity than between the so-called races. right? And yet, notice color. That's how you be anti-racist. Doesn't make any sense. It's one or the other, you know. So that's the world that we live in, though. There is no reverse racism. There's just racism, and the people who call themselves the quote-unquote anti-racists are the biggest racists of them all. And the truth is, it's the same party. It's always been this myth that the parties flipped. The parties flipped. The parties never flipped. The Democrats are still the party of slavery, still the party of racism, Jim Crow, and the Republicans are still the party of Lincoln, still the party of the individual. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. We'll see you.